Some things are hard to speak about for various reasons, and this is one of them. And when I told Wanda what I was speaking of today, she said, I don't know if you should do that or not, but I am. Because I think this is an essential thing of Christianity. And frankly, if Christianity does not speak to this question, then we need to close up shop and go home. When he was in his late 70s, my wife's grandfather on her mother's side was sitting out on the porch late one afternoon. He got up to go into the house and he fell over. Now his wife called my mother and father-in-law and they went down there. We just lived like a quarter of a mile away. They got him in the house and they called 911. Within 5 minutes he was dead. He was living at home independently, doing most anything he wanted to do until 5 minutes before he died. I had an uncle who lived at home. He lived alone. His wife had been dead several years. He was 86. And he had been out on the lawnmower one day mowing his grass. He apparently felt sick. He stopped the lawnmower in front of the door of the house, and they found his body in the bedroom laying on the floor with the phone in his hand. And they said that they surmised that he had gotten sick on the lawnmower, went in to call someone, but fell over dead, and they said he died probably within 2 minutes. My grandmother on my mother's side of the family was in her mid-70s. She lived alone. She was in reasonably good health. She did her own grocery shopping, did her own housework, did her own laundry, did most everything for herself. One Thursday evening, about 10:30, she called my mother and said she did not feel well. My mother went out there. She saw that she was very sick, so she called the doctor. It was back during the day when you could actually call them, you know. So the doctor asked my mother if she felt cold and clammy, and Mother said yes. And the doctor said, call 911 and have her brought to the hospital, and I'll meet you over there. That's when doctors used to do that too. So we went to the hospital, and the doctor came in and examined her. By that time she was unconscious. He said that she had had a massive heart attack. She died on Saturday morning, about 36 hours after she had the heart attack. In contrast to that, my mother was sick 9 years before she died. My mother's first cousin was sick 19 years before she died from a progressive neurological disorder. Wanda's aunt was sick 12 years before she died. And Wanda's mother was sick a little over 6 years before she died. The question comes up, why do some people stay healthy up until basically the time they die, while others get sick and slowly deteriorate for years and years and get in really bad shape? Why is that the way things work? What we're really asking is, why do things work this way? Who controls them? Who set it up to work that way? Off the cuff, we might think that as Christians, this should not even be a question. We should immediately say, well, God set it up to work that way. Some people live to be 86-year-old, healthy, living at home, mowing their own grass, and all just sat down and fall over dead in 2 minutes, while other people lay in bed for 19 years and deteriorate. God's the one that set things up that way. Why? Because that's the way God wants it to be. After all, aren't we as Christians supposed to believe that God is all-powerful, that God is in control of absolutely everything, and if there's anything on earth that's going on that God doesn't like or doesn't want to go on, doesn't God have the power to change it? That's what a lot of Christians believe. God is the one who caused my uncle to live at home, and he had a very comfortable life until he was 86 years old and fell over dead in 2 minutes. On the other hand, God is the one that caused my mother's first cousin to deteriorate for 19 years with the progressive neurological disorder. It's all part of some sort of plan that God has, but rest assured, God's in control of it. Yes, He is. Now that might sound good if you're the healthy one living at home alone when you're 86 years old. But what if you're the one who's been deteriorating for 19 years? How would that sound to you? So how do Christians deal with this question? First, as we do a lot of times, we go back to a man named John Calvin, because we have, as we've said before, John Calvin is the single person above anybody else in the world, even Jesus himself, that had influence on American Christianity. So we always go back to him, because he was basically the creator of American Christianity. Now we've seen before how John Calvin said that God chooses who goes to heaven and who goes to hell, and that choice is made before you're even born. It's not up to you. It doesn't depend on how good or bad you were. It's simply a choice God makes before you're born. Those whom God chose to go to heaven, Calvin called the elect. Those whom God chose to go to hell, Calvin called the reprobate. You have no say in the matter. When you are born, come out of your mother's womb, the choice has already been made. You're either heaven-bound or hell-bound from that moment on. Now, naturally, when Calvin came up with that idea, what do you think happened? Well, people are going to wonder, am I one of the ones that's going to hell? I mean, what if you knew that you were one of the ones going to hell, and there's nothing you could do to change it? You could get down on your knees. You could beg Jesus to forgive you. No, you're going to hell. You couldn't change it. And you lived your whole life knowing that you'd burn forever. So people naturally did wonder. So Calvin came up with a way you could know. And Calvin said you can tell who's going to heaven and who's going to hell by how their lives go. The ones who are going to heaven, that is the elect, they are successful. They are wealthy. They are well off. They are loved by everybody. They have a good life. See what I said? Can you see the American society that believes in Calvin's beliefs here? However, if someone is sickly, if they haven't done well in life, if they're poor, unsuccessful, if life doesn't go well for them, then they're among the reprobate who are going to hell. Calvin had it all figured out. You can look at people, the ones whose life goes well, the ones that are healthy and wealthy and everything goes good for them, those are the elect going to heaven. The poor people, the sick people, and all those are the ones going to hell. So we've got our question answered on. My uncle, who lived in his own home independently, until 86 years old with good health, and fell over dead 2 minutes, was one of the elect going to heaven. My cousin, who deteriorated for 19 years and got in awful shape before she died, was one of those who were going to hell. Calvin answered it for him. And his answer was accepted within much of Christianity for many years. But as we talked about before, around the year 1900, many versions of American Christianity began to reject Calvinism. And so they realized they had a need to explain these differences. And the explanation they came up with says that God strikes you down for sin. God makes you pay for your sins. And He does that by sending bad things in your life. Are you sick? Did you lose your job? Did you get a demotion? Have you just never been rich? You know, are you poor? You still scraping by? We know what that is. God's striking you down for sin. You look on the other side of town, the people that have the big houses and the fine cars, and they have all this stuff and all, and they're healthy, and they're going out and playing tennis and all that. Those are the people who have lived good lives. They have pleased God, and so God is rewarding them. On this side of town where the poor people live and the sick people live and all, those are the people who have sinned and God has struck them down. My cousin, who was sick for 19 years, believed that. She sat there day after day wondering what in the world she had done in her life that was so bad to cause God to strike her down like that. In her mind, she had tried to live a good life. She knew she had never been perfect. But she always knew that she had tried to do right. And she thought that for the most part, she had done right. But yet she must have committed some horrible sin somewhere back there for which God had struck her down. She could find no other explanation. She just couldn't figure out what those sins were. What were those sins that had caused God to strike her down like that? And you know what? She was embarrassed to be seen in public. Why? Because she knew that when people saw the shape she was in, they would immediately know, look at that sinner. Wonder what she did that made God strike her down like that. She would say, people like me should stay at home and not be seen out in public. Do we really believe either of the two ways I've talked about in days of late conflict? Do you really believe that? What about the passage I read today where Jesus says God makes the sun to shine and the rain to fall on both the just and the unjust? What about in the New Testament where it says that God does not intend for any to perish? What about the passage that says that the hairs of our head are numbered and that not even a sparrow falls from the sky that God does not see? Do those passages only apply to God's favorites? Do they only apply to God's teacher's pets? So how do we deal with these questions? I've seen people, I saw another woman who was in the bed for 25 years with a neurological disorder. And I know she wondered about those things because occasionally she'd let her guard down. And one or two words would slip out. Or occasionally, like at 3 o'clock in the morning, she'd send me an email. And then the next day, she'd sort of come to her senses and be scared to death because she'd done that. You see, day after day, she lay there in bed, wondering what she'd done. God had struck her down like that. And the way she looked at it, if God would strike her down like that for something she couldn't even remember that she did, what in the world would God do to her if she expressed some kind of doubt? What would he do? And so she lay there scared to death when those questions would come into her mind. She was scared that God would do something even worse to her just for letting those questions come into her mind. I have seen people struggle with these questions to the point where they really didn't like God anymore, where they lost their faith, whether they would admit it to themselves or anyone else, they lost their faith. And then they knew that and it scared them because they think, oh gosh, now you really get me. Where does it go back to? It goes back to the belief held by many Christians that things work this way because God set them up to work this way and because God wants them to work that way. Combined with the belief that God controls everything and has the power to intervene and change everything. It goes back to the belief that everything that happens is part of God's plan. We might not understand the plan, but be sure God's working it out and it's God's plan. God's in control. Oh, yes, He is. And I guess that's technically what most versions of Christianity that most of us came from have said. The first time in my life, I'll tell you this, that I ever thought seriously about my Christian faith I was raised in church, and I went to church all of my life. The first time in my life that I ever thought seriously about my Christian faith was my second year at Chapel Hill, and I had a new roommate that year. I invited this guy to go to church that Sunday morning. He wouldn't go. So I thought, well, he just don't feel like it. So the next Sunday, I invited him to go to church. He wouldn't go. And this went on for 2 or 3 weeks. And finally, I invited him to go to church one Sunday morning. He said, I'm not going. I said, why won't you go to church? Because, I was raised that you went to church on Sunday morning unless you're deathly ill or something. We went to church. So I said, why won't you go to church? He said, well, let me tell you something. Well, I knew that this had happened, but I didn't know all the whole story. 2 years earlier, both his father and grandfather had drowned at Myrtle Beach while the family was down there on vacation. And when that happened, I was 16 years old. He, like me, had been taken to church all of his life. And so he went to the minister of that church, a big fancy church with mauve colorings in the middle of town, He went to that church and asked his minister why that happened. Why did God let that happen? And his minister said, look, God had a plan in all this, and you better not question it. And that caused this kid at age 16 to remove himself from Christianity. He never, ever went back again. Never, ever went back. Now, so those are some of the beliefs that people can have. In contrast to that is the scientific Christian. Scientific Christians are very numerous today, and these Christians believe that if God had anything to do with creating the world in the first place, other than setting the thing in motion, that when it was created, God stepped back, wound the clock, and set up natural forces and everything plays out. God is not active in the world at all. God just sits up there in heaven somewhere, may or may not pay this any attention. But some people get sick just because maybe they don't have as good of an immune system as others do. It's just due to natural forces. Maybe they take better care of themselves than other people. Maybe by the luck of the draw, they got better genes. And so God's not involved in any of this. It's just natural processes playing themselves out. It's a gamble. Some have good luck, some have bad luck. This is the modern Christian scientific way of looking at it because it places science at the top. And then science tells us everything is a result of natural forces. Even though somebody's not overweight, though, or in any risk categories, they may have a stroke. It's not only the people that weigh 700 pounds and eat McDonald's every day for lunch that have heart attacks. Some people who are trim and slim and exercise also have heart attacks. Believe it or not, they do. I know some of them. But anyway, it's natural forces. God doesn't have anything to do with it. So let's assume we do not want to take the old Calvinist view and say God is showing who the elect are and who the reprobate are by how good your life goes. Assume we don't want to take the fundamentalist view that God strikes you down for sin. Assume we don't want to take the mainline Christian view that God has a plan. And assume we don't want to take the scientific Christian view that God's not involved in it. How can we make sense of it? First of all, we have to realize that, as the Apostle Paul said, we are seeing through a mirror darkly. We see only in part. We see only a part of what's really going on. It won't be till we finally get to heaven till we'll see the whole picture. But even though at this time we can't see the whole picture, we can at least do better than the explanations I've talked about today. We can at least do better. I was in seminary 4 years. I've been in ministry for 13 years. And I have spent many, many hours studying the Bible, studying theology, studying various versions of Christianity. And I'm not by any means holding myself to be an expert, but I'll say that in all of the possible answers I have come across to this question, I've only seen one that made any sense to me. I would admit it's not popular today. It's certainly not the answer from any of the major versions of Christianity around here. It's the best one I've ever seen. It's very simple. There are other powers in the world that act in opposition to God, and that God is at this moment not in control. I know that's hard for people to accept because, we live in a scientific world that tells us there are no spiritual powers. And then we live in a world of fundamentalist Christianity that tells us that the spiritual power is only God. Nothing else out there, and God's supreme to do anything. So this is sort of heretical in today's Christian life, to think that there are other powers out there that God is not in control of. That's the only way that I know these ways. In contrast with God, who wants the best for us and wants good for us, these other powers want to destroy us, want bad for us. They love to see us suffer. They love to see us in distress. They love agony and grief and chaos. And they operate trying to cause these things. We do not know where they came from, but we know they're active in the world. They're not only active in the international scene, they're active in Washington, D.C., they're active in Raleigh, they're active in Cleveland County, they're active in your neighborhood, they're active in your house. They're active in our personal life. They want nothing more than to destroy us and make us miserable. These powers are talked about in the New Testament. They are called principalities and powers. They are called rule and authority, elementals, spirits, demons, unclean spirits. It is these powers God is working to save us from, but they are strong. And they cannot be defeated easily. They can be defeated only after a long, protracted struggle. That's why it says in the Bible that Jesus must rule until he has placed all enemies under his feet. He is in the process of doing it now. He is placing all enemies under his feet. They're not under there yet. If you look in the New Testament, you will see that God is not called Lord God Almighty until in Revelation, after they are defeated. So we live in a time when God is working as hard as he can in my life, in your life, in everybody's life, to give them the best. When God is working as hard as he can to counter these other powers that are trying to plunge us into misery and chaos. Sometimes in one situation God wins, sometimes in the other situation they win. You can think of it as many, many battles going on at the same time between God and these forces of destruction. Sometimes God wins, sometimes they win. But what Christianity tells us is that one day the war is going to be over. And when that happens, God will have won the war. And that's what we look forward to. And that's what we call the second coming of Jesus. God wins the war. And when these powers of evil that seek our destruction are vanquished and totally defeated. Why does one person live to be 86 in good health, who I can assure you was no saint, while another person lies in the bed for 20 years? It's because forces like that. God's trying to work good in everybody, no matter how bad they are, no matter how much they sin. God's trying to give everybody good. He's making his sun to shine and rain to fall on both the just and the unjust. God's giving everybody good. It's these other powers over here that are evil. But sometimes God is unable to counter those powers at this time. And I know that might seem blasphemous to even suggest that God's not all-powerful, that God just doesn't wave his arm and something happens. Because I know that's what we're used to hearing. We're used to hearing nothing happens that God doesn't want to happen. But God gave us minds to think. Think. God did not intend for us to blindly believe what other people tell us. So think for a minute. Is it God's will when a 7-year-old girl is raped and murdered? Is it God's will when a 25-year-old couple with 2 children are killed in a car wreck and leaving children as orphans? Is it God's will for diseases to cripple young children? Is it God's will for people to live in poverty in a stressed area of the world while bombs rain down on them, even bomb their schools and hospitals, and we sit over here silent about it? Is that God's will? For people to live like that? If you believe God controls everything, then you have to answer yes to that. If those things are God's will, is there any way in the world you can use the word God and love in the same sentence? There's no way to even begin to make sense of the way things work if you posit only one power in the universe. If you posit only God out in the universe, there is no way to make sense of the way things work and at the same time hold to what the New Testament tells us about God. And I know this sounds blasphemous, and I know it's not what we've been used to hearing, but I don't know of any other way to explain it. I really don't. And I have spent a third of my life working on this stuff. Now, I'm not suggesting that the way I've outlined today is the complete picture. We still have to realize that we only see in part. But based on what we do see and what we can understand, I think this is the only way to make sense of things like this. Now, it is true that for every other way I've talked about today, you can go to the Bible and take your little scissors and cut out a little verse and say, yes, this proves this. You can do that for any of those ways, but I'm not talking about taking a pair of scissors and cutting out 3 verses. I'm talking about looking at the entire biblical witness in its totality for what it really is. If you look at the entire biblical witness in its totality, I think the way that I've talked about today is the best way that I've seen over all these years to explain the answer to that question.